blood here.
Mommy, what's the matter with him? Why is he bleeding?
Oh, just don't look at him, honey, okay?
Is he going to die?
No, he'll be okay.
We're told that bloody scenes like that are not uncommon at racetracks, where a drug called Lasix is not currently being used to prevent it. It can be unsettling for spectators and obviously harmful to racing and the racehorse. To find out why respiratory bleeding happens in horses and what we can do about it, we've come here to visit Dr. Mark DiDomenico, a cardiovascular surgeon and researcher whose extensive research with humans and thoroughbreds is well known throughout the world. Dr. DiDomenico is also the founder of Pegasus Thoroughbred Training, Rehabilitation, and Research Center here in Redmond, Washington, where several research projects on rehabilitation of thoroughbreds is going on. This includes studies in osteoarthritis, middle and lower back injuries, and platelet-rich plasma, as well as stem cell healing in tendons and suspensory injuries.
Okay, baby doll. Now, you can go in.
Good morning, doctor. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Hi, it's my pleasure. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So my first question for you is it really true that the horses bleed into their lungs when they're racing?
Well, yes, all breeds of horses bleed into their lungs when they're fully extended in exercise or racing. The incidence of bleeding increases with speed, with distance, how old they are, and how cold the day is. When it comes to thoroughbred racehorses, it's believed that at least 90% of them bleed into their lungs.
So if it is that common, it must be somewhat acceptable.
Well, it shouldn't be acceptable. When it happens, it can frighten the horse, which can cause the horse to slow down or even stop running. If the bleeding is severe enough, it can cause the immediate death of the horse during the race. I believe this year already there have been 6 deaths on the racetrack from bleeding into the lungs. Besides the death of this wonderful animal, the jockey also can become severely injured as the horse goes down. And the other jockeys and other horses in the races can collide with the horses dying on the track. This is what we call exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage.
So that's the official term, exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage?
That's right.
So what causes the horses to bleed into their lungs and what can be done about that?
Well, let's step inside and I'll show you some of the physiology that goes along with this and we can see exactly how this happens. How's that?
That sounds great,
You
thanks.
bet. Come on.
All right.
You see, what's happening when a horse is bleeding into his lungs is somewhat similar that happens in humans, like yourself, when you have hypertension or high blood pressure. By the way, did you know that 75 million Americans have hypertension or high blood pressure?
I didn't know that.
Do you know what your normal blood pressure is?
120/70?
That's correct. But there are 3 things that can cause your blood pressure to increase. First, if you increase the amount of blood or fluid in a cardiovascular system, which by the way consists of your heart, lungs, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Anyway, as you increase the amount of fluid, your blood pressure increases as more fluid is forced into the same vascular space. Second, if you increase the amount of blood flow through your arteries by increasing the pumping action of your heart, it will increase your blood pressure. Third, you have a complex system of nerves and hormones that regulate blood pressure, and they can go wrong, causing an increase in your blood pressure also.
So is that the same for a horse?
Yes, basically, but no matter what the cause in the human body, as blood pressure increases, say from a normal of 120/70 to 130/80, 140/90, 150/100, 160/110, and so forth, like any system which fluid flows through under pressure, if you increase the pressure in your system, any weak spots in that system will spring a leak. If a small artery in your head springs a leak from this increased pressure or hypertension, you have a hemorrhagic stroke. Not a good thing.
Nicely said.
And because strokes are so devastating, physicians treat hypertension very aggressively. The first line of treatment for humans with high blood pressure is to decrease the amount of fluid in the cardiovascular system by using a diuretic like Lasix. Lasix causes the kidneys to remove excess water and salt from the circulating blood volume, dropping the blood pressure back to normal. Now, if Lasix can do that for humans,
Can it do it for horses?
that's the point. Horses have a similar problem, except the problem is from the right heart, which, as you know, pumps blood to the lungs, where the blood exchanges carbon dioxide for oxygen before being sent to the left heart to be pumped out to the body. You know what? Horses are an amazing animal when they're racing. First, their heart rate goes from 40 beats per minute at rest to 220 beats when running full out. Second, they consume about 19 gallons of oxygen per minute into their lungs. And third, the blood flows through their lungs at 75 gallons per minute.
Wow, that's amazing.
And that 75 gallons per minute goes through tissue called alveoli, which is made up of a very thin-walled capillary airspace where oxygen and carbon dioxide can be exchanged. Capillaries are only 3/10,000ths of a millimeter thick. 3/10,000ths. That's thinner than tissue paper and is very fragile.
Tissue paper. I had no idea.
Okay, so at rest, the horse's right heart beats around 40 times per minute, and the pressure in the arteries going to the lungs is about 35 millimeters of mercury. But as the horse runs, the heart rate for both the right and left heart increases, and when fully extended, the heart rate reaches the 220 beats per minute. Remember, I told you that if you increase the flow in an enclosed system like the horse's circulatory system, increased flow causes increased blood pressure. When the right heart rate increases from 40 beats a minute to 220 beats per minute, the pulmonary artery pressure goes up from 35 millimeters of mercury to 95 millimeters of mercury. That's almost triple the normal pressure in the pulmonary system and is called pulmonary hypertension or pulmonary high blood pressure.
I see.
And what's your normal blood pressure again?
120/70.
Right, and the horse is running with almost triple the normal pressure in its pulmonary arteries and capillaries. What do you suppose would happen to you if I was to double your blood pressure, say from 120/70 to 240/140?
I hate to think about that.
Well, you'd eventually stroke by rupturing a vessel in your brain. And you'd probably also bleed into your eyes, which would cause blindness, and bleed into your kidneys and so forth. Well, that's what happens in the horse's lungs when you triple the normal pressure. Remember, the tissue is only 3/10,000ths of a millimeter thick with a capillary vessel in it. So it ruptures and the horse bleeds into its lungs. You know, the horse feels this. I believe it would be the same feeling you'd get when liquid goes down the wrong way into your lungs when you occasionally are taking a drink. Humans have a cough reflex to get rid of the water. Horses have a reflex, but it's not very strong. I'm sure when they bleed, they feel like they're being waterboarded. Occasionally, the bleeding is so massive that you see part of the blood coming up through the throat and out through the nose. You know what? That's a lot of bleeding.
It's not a pretty sight.
No, it's not. And in horses, increased blood pressure is compounded by two additional problems. First, remember that the horse is traveling at about 35 miles per hour, hitting on one foot at a time, which sends a severe concussion up the limb into the chest and lung cavity. This brings shear stress on the delicate lung tissue. Some people believe that this is what causes the tissue to tear or to bleed. Second, when you raise the pressure in the arteries or veins of a body, they will become thicker, which narrows the lumen of the vessel and makes the vessel lose its elasticity and flexibility. Both of these things cause a further increase in the pressure. It's probably a combination of high blood pressure, shear stress, and vein thickening that causes the bleeding. In humans who get pulmonary hypertension, the prognosis is impending death, unless you can correct the cause through medication or surgery. But in the horse, if the horse's bleeding is severe enough, they'll bleed out through their nose. And as I said, this happens a lot. Sometimes during a race and sometimes after a race.
So if this is so frequent, what happens to the blood in the horse's lungs?
You know, that's an important question. The fact is, the horse accumulates damaged tissue. Some of the tissue will heal, but unfortunately the remainder forms scar tissue, and the horse loses valuable lung tissue. With each bleed, the amount of scar tissue increases, and more lung is lost. With the loss of lung tissue, we have a loss of performance. The horse may also become frightened, causing it to run slowly since it doesn't want to go through the feeling of being waterboarded.
So what's the solution? You had implied that possibly Lasix.
I'm not applying anything. I'm stating a fact. The question everyone wants answered is, how do we stop exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage or bleeding into the lungs of our racehorses? The answer is simple. We lower the blood pressure in the lungs of the horses, the same as we do in humans, and we use Lasix. Lasix given 4 hours before the race will decrease the amount of fluid in the vascular system by eliminating excess water. It also relaxes the smooth muscle in the pulmonary arteries and veins. With less fluid and circulating volume, plus vessel relaxation, the pressure in the lungs while racing full out with a heart rate of 220 never goes above 80 millimeters of mercury, which for the most part and in most horses stops the occurrence of exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. There may be some horses, like some humans, where Lasix by itself will not drop the pressure enough to stop the bleeding totally. These horses may need additional medication to totally correct the pressure.
Well, then if it's that simple, why isn't everybody doing it? What's the argument against Lasix?
You're going to hear the Europeans don't use race day Lasix, and the United States therefore should stop using it. However, they don't tell you several important facts. First, horses bleed in Europe and trainers use Lasix in training them. Second, their race tracks and their training tracks are different. These tracks often create less severe concussions through the legs into the chest and lung cavity. Third, they also train and race differently than we do in the United States. In racing, they start slowly and gradually increase their speed throughout the race, which keeps their heart rate from reaching 220 beats per minute. Most European races are of long distances. Most US races are short, like 3/4 of a mile to a mile. And Americans breed for speed right out of the gate. And fourth, they share a problem of exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. They work within the framework of no medication on race day. You know, the question is this the best thing for the horse? You know what? Let me show you something. The bottom line for me, when I find my patient has hypertension, I treat his hypertension with drugs like Lasix. Lasix by itself sometimes does not reduce hypertension completely. So some of my patients are on 3 different drugs in combination. That helps to control their hypertension. Concerning thoroughbreds, as many as 90% or more of horses bleed from exercise-induced pulmonary hypertension. Therefore, I refuse to run my horses without Lasix. You know, all in all, life's pretty simple. If I have a patient that has hypertension, it's my ethical and moral responsibility to put that patient on medications to get his blood pressure down, so I start with Lasix. If Lasix is inadequate, I'll add 2 or 3 more drugs in combination until they have a normal blood pressure. With these horses, these wonderful animals, I'm morally and ethically responsible for taking care of them too. And it's real simple. If this horse is going to bleed into his lungs during a race when he's racing full out, then it's my responsibility to make sure he's on a drug like Lasix so he doesn't do that. You know what? These are great animals, and look how wonderful they are.